Good evening. Right now, Metro Police are desperately searching for the person or people responsible for killing a man and a woman.
I got a male down in Bow Street.
Breaking news now, a triple shooting leaves 2 dead.
Never expect for somebody to tell you your loved one was murdered.
This Labor Day will mark 42 years that have haunted the St. Cloud family.
30 years. 30 years this family has waited for answers.
A couple months go by, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you really start to struggle with the idea that the case might not get solved and that somebody might get away with murder.
It's very unfortunate that we have any cold cases at all, and certainly unfortunate that we have as many as we do. And that's why Ryan's work and the work of Project Cold Case is so important.
All right, thank you for joining us today. Today is February 19th, and we have a special guest in. It's kind of been a lot of the same faces rotating through here, but today we wanted to dive a little deeper into the meat and potatoes of crime forensics. And so Amanda Stratton is here joining me today. Thanks for joining us, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Great. You are an actual crime laboratory analyst.
Yes, I am.
You're a scientist.
I am.
You actually deal with DNA samples, testing, analyzing.
Yes, that is my job description.
Okay, and pretty good for a layperson, right?
Yeah.
No, I've been around crime enough over the last few years and been in enough trials that I have witnessed a number of expert testimony from analysts. And so I have a little bit of a grasp. I'm also just outside of it enough to get completely confused with DNA. So I'm gonna ask you some questions today, and then we're gonna see if we can break it down so that a lot of the people that are probably joining us today may have cases that are unsolved cases. And there's a lot of confusion with DNA and where it comes from, if it's available in cases, and whether it's going to lead to answers for everybody or not as technology goes forward. So you're going to help us with that today.
Sounds good.
Let's start with a little background from you and your education, how you got into this, where you work now, and talk a little bit about that.
I have wanted to do this as a career for as long as I can remember. So I knew from early on in high school that I needed to pursue a career that was heavily focused, a degree that was heavily focused in science. I did attend the University of Central Florida, and I have a degree in forensic science with a minor in chemistry. And that allowed me to pursue a job in the field. Now I'm currently employed as a crime lab analyst in the biology section at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement here in Jacksonville, Florida.
We refer to as FDLE.
Correct.
Because that's a mouthful.
It is, yes.
And FDLE has a number of labs and offices around the state. I don't know exactly how many, but there's Tallahassee, Jacksonville, Orlando,
Tampa, Pensacola,
Fort Myers, maybe,
and Fort Myers.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. So and each of those has, not all of them have all the same departments, but most of them have crime labs, right?
So the major functions of FDLE are to provide forensic and investigative services to our local counties and cities. Here in Jacksonville, we serve 13 counties in the North Florida region.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a lot. It's a big area.
And how long have you been at FDLE now?
A little over 5 years now.
Okay. Mm-hmm. In the, what do you call that department that you're in? Is it the biology or?
Yes. So I work on the forensic side, and my specific discipline is in biology.
Okay. Good deal. And so give us a little bit about like your day to day. When you go to work, what might be waiting for you?
So I'm assigned a batch of cases at a time, and so a typical day for me could include examining an item of evidence for the possible presence of bodily fluids. I will perform tests to identify those bodily fluids, and collecting these samples for DNA testing. I also perform the DNA testing as well, and then I will write reports, make comparisons of the DNA profiles obtained from items of evidence to the DNA profiles from known individuals, and I report my findings and testify as needed.
Okay, yeah, so that's obviously a very important job. I mean, specifically, you know, what we're dealing with cold cases and hot cases where somebody has been assaulted or murdered. You have a very important job. So I'm guessing that there's some training once you get hired by FDLE that you maybe have to go through and then kind of keep current.
That's correct. The training program for a DNA analyst with FDLE is very rigorous. And also I should mention the requirements for the position include a degree in the natural sciences, plus specific to my field, there are 4 courses that have to be taken at the college level, which include genetics, biochemistry, molecular biology, and statistics, because statistics actually plays an important role in my reporting process. So on top of those requirements, we also undergo a training program that takes roughly 2 years. And
wow.
Yeah, it's broken down into 2 modules, or 2 phases, with each phase consisting of a series of modules. And for each module, we have to do a lot of heavy academic reading and a lot of laboratory testing. And each module ends with a written exam. And then after each phase, we have to take an oral examination with our peers.
Oh, wow. All right. So, and that's continuing education as well. After you get through all of that, then you've got to do that. How often do you have to do kind of update on?
So once we have completed the training program, we have to undergo continuing education on an annual basis. And usually that includes webinars, virtual educational classes and workshops, and oftentimes conferences across the United States.
Okay. And so you mentioned testifying in court.
Mm-hmm.
Have you had the luxury of
I have, yes.
testifying?
Yes, I have.
All right. That's always fun, right?
Yeah.
Tell me, you know, I've sat and witnessed a trial, and I've watched the juries whenever it's DNA time, because it's easy to get lost in the scientific, you know, realm and you know, the complicated nature of your career. And I'm sure you've kept an eye on jurors at times, you know, to kind of gauge whether you're losing them or not. There's a delicate line there to get across what is scientific, but in terms that everyday people understand that aren't in a lab every single day.
Correct. I think that is one of the most difficult aspects of my career, is having to convey to a jury what my job entails in layman's terms.
Yeah. And I mean, just from what you've told us today, the educational background, what you had to do to get to the point to get hired,
Correct.
And then what you had to do once you were hired, you know, to actually be an analyst. And then, I mean, we talked a little bit in the past and earlier about proficiency testing. I mean, there's somebody that goes along behind you typically, right? And
so a proficiency test, we are required to take a proficiency test twice a year. And essentially what that means is an outside external agency sends us a test where the answers are known to them but unknown to me.
to you.
And I treat it as I would other normal casework, and it's checked to see if I obtained the expected results.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so then in the day-to-day world where you are working on a criminal case, and you, at the end of your analysis, you create a report.
Yes.
And then is that reviewed too before it goes any further?
Yes, we have a thorough review process. It goes through something called a technical review, which is performed by my peers, and they will check it for technical accuracy, and then it will undergo an administrative review that is performed by my supervisors to check for clerical errors, administrative errors, before it can be released to our submitting agency.
Wow. So there's a lot that goes into these. So kind of, you know, it's easy, to hear these sensational stories of the wrong person being convicted, typically those were before DNA, and now DNA is used to exonerate them, as opposed to.
Yeah, I mean, contrary to popular belief, DNA actually is not the end all be all to solving a crime. It's really used as an investigative lead or to assist in exoneration. It's
another tool.
Correct.
To find the right person and put them away. So this is the question that you get on the stand, and one of the first questions: what is DNA? And break it down.
I'll give you my explanation that I give to the jury.
Okay,
How about that?
Perfect.
Okay, so DNA, it's an acronym that stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It is found within every cell of our body with the exception of mature red blood cells. And it's consistent throughout the body. We get half of our DNA from our mothers, half of our DNA from our fathers. No two individuals have the same DNA profile with the exception of identical twins.
Okay. Identical twins, same DNA, everybody else, there's some kind of variation in there.
Correct.
All right. That's pretty easy enough to understand.
Yeah.
That's a good way of describing it. Clint, are you got it? All right. Clint was going to be our gauge today, and he said if we got too scientific, he was going to dial us back a bit. So he's listening and making sure that we're, what's that? Oh, yeah. So you are a twin.
I do have an identical twin.
An identical twin.
I do.
Right,
we have the same DNA profile.
So you're one of the few people that has somebody else has your DNA.
Correct.
Exact. All right. So let's talk about in the criminal forensic world. A crime happens. There is DNA left at the scene, or there's I don't even know how to. There's samples left at the scene. There's bodily fluids. There's biological, evidence left at the scene. What of that evidence? Let's talk about what. And excuse my layman, but what's easy to get DNA from? What's difficult to get DNA from? Where you're specifically looking. There's so many different types of DNA now, with touch DNA. And so explain that a little bit. If you're not an evidence technician, that's something we should point out, that evidence technicians are very different. I know on the show CSI, the original one from way back, and I know some law enforcement agencies do have their own lab. I mean, FDLE is also a law enforcement agency.
Correct.
And I think Miami Dade has a lab inside their agency, but those still aren't, the evidence technicians are separate from the scientists.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's a little bit of a misnomer.
Yes.
If you're getting your information from television. The evidence technicians are somebody else. They work with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office here in town, but obviously they know what you're looking for, have some kind of idea what is the best evidence to collect to get a result from your lab.
Yes. So generally we accept evidence for all kinds of cases, robberies, burglaries, sexual assaults, homicide death investigations, criminal paternities. We even work DUI death investigations. So we get all kinds of evidence related to those types of crimes. And there are different sources of DNA that are more rich in DNA.
Right.
And then some that are more unpredictable. I would say the more rich sources of DNA would be bodily fluids such as blood, semen, or saliva. Bones and tissue are also rich sources of DNA. We also work items to test for possible wearer. So, for instance, let's say a shirt is left behind at the scene of a crime from the suspect. We can swab the shirt to determine who could have possibly been wearing the shirt.
And you typically, from my experience, you don't test an entire shirt if you don't have to. So you would look for areas around the neck, under the armpits, where there's sweat, where there's constant contact with the body, and that helps to kind of narrow your focus a little bit on something like wearer DNA, right?
Yes, exactly. So like you said, the collar, underarm areas, anywhere where you would suspect there to be maybe a lot of friction with the skin cells is where I might focus on collecting my sample from. And those are good samples of DNA, not excellent like bodily fluids.
Right. So that's on that lower end, not rich.
Correct.
In terms of
it's a decent source, yeah.
But we hear a lot, people think based on television that touch DNA is something where I touch this microphone and all of a sudden my DNA is on there, and that's not always true. Specific touch DNA, you're probably not going to get much off that microphone from what I just did. Now, if I was holding it and walking around with it, and
correct,
that kind of way, then maybe. But
yes,
we hear criminally a lot of times you might search a victim's pockets, specifically if their pockets were turned inside out,
yes,
and that somebody reached in there and pulled something out. You might try to find it, but that's. I'm trying to think of. I think you worded it earlier that
it's more
that's
of an
unpredictable
source of DNA. So a lot of people weren't aware that we can actually obtain DNA from a touch sample, is what we call it. But somebody gripping an item, especially if there is, it depends on the surface, if it's rough or if it's smooth, and how long the individual was gripping the item, or if their hands were sweaty, or how often do they wash their hands.
Right.
There's a number of factors that play into how much DNA can be recovered from an item that I would swab for touch DNA. So it is a lot more unpredictable. I think the statistic that comes into my head is around 85% of our touch DNA cases actually yield no DNA.
Ain't doing it. Yeah. That would make sense to me based on my experience and what I've seen, and I would say that the flip side of that is most people think it's the other way, that 85% do lead to something, and that's just not the case. Now, we'll get into this a little bit later, but technology just keeps, leaps and bounds growing, and there will be a time where, I'm sure touch DNA will be a lot easier to obtain and be able to read. But that remains to be seen, with how technology advances.
So one of the other challenges with touch DNA is oftentimes we obtain mixtures.
Right.
So a mixture is a DNA profile where I can look at the profile and tell more than one individual's DNA is present on that sample, and it makes it very difficult to interpret that sample when it's unpredictable.
Yeah, and you deal with mixtures sometimes even within more highly rich samples.
That's correct.
And is technology out there that assists in separating those mixtures so you can identify. So for people that are trying to visualize that, maybe a very violent attack where the victim's blood is mixed, but he is fighting back and draws blood from the suspect, and now you have a pool of blood with two different people, the victim and the suspect. Not that long ago, depending on that mixture, you might not have been able to do anything with that other than say it's a mixture and we can't exclude somebody or we can't include somebody, right?
Correct. Yes.
So, but now technology has gotten to a point where it's easier for you. Is that accurate to separate mixtures?
I now use a software program. I'm going to use a very technical term here. It's actually called a probabilistic genotyping software. But it basically helps me to separate the individual contributors to a mixture, and it helps me in generating a statistic of how rare or how common that DNA profile is in the general population.
So again, we've talked now about a couple of testing ways that that technology has improved just in the few years you've been in a lab that has made solving crimes a little easier, but it's another tool. Not that one of these things always is the end all be all, but all of these things help investigators find the right person and put them behind bars, hold them accountable. So tell me, I probably missed a question here that we had typed out, but STR DNA. So get me from where we are now to what you're looking at and what short tandem repeat DNA is.
So the type of DNA testing that I perform in the forensic laboratory is actually a lot different than what the media might be familiar with. So, or the general population is more familiar with the genealogy type of DNA testing, and that's not the type of DNA testing I perform in the forensic lab currently. So the one I perform is called STR DNA testing, and it stands for short tandem repeat.
And let me jump in real quick. So again, in layman's terms and basics, if I submitted my DNA to 23andMe, that's not what you're using.
Correct.
Those are two totally different types of analyzation of DNA to reach two different conclusions. Okay.
Yes.
So STR is what you do.
Correct.
And that is?
So short tandem repeat. So essentially, I'm looking at 21 locations on our genetic makeup with 3 gender determining locations.
Okay, and these are loci, if people have heard
Correct.
that in court or on TV. Those specific locations
Correct.
are referred to as loci.
Loci, yes.
And you're looking for 23?
Yes.
23 of those and 3 gender markers.
Correct.
Okay.
And then at each of those locations, I would expect to see 2 different DNA types, one from the mother and one from the father.
Okay.
So we inherited half from the mom, half from the dad. So I expect to see 2 different numbers there. And what I'm looking at is how many times is that DNA segment repeated at each of those locations.
Okay.
That number of times is representative of that DNA type.
Okay.
So it could be different. The DNA pattern could have been repeated 12 times, and it could have been repeated 13 times. So for 12 times in the mother, 13 times in the father, so that individual's profile at that location would be 12,13.
Okay. All right.
Sometimes they're repeated the same amount in the mother and the father, so it would just be a 12-12.
12-12. And you do that at each of those 23
Correct.
locations.
Yes.
To identify basically numerically a genetic or a DNA profile?
Correct.
Is that basically what the profile is those numbers from
Yes.
each location?
Yes.
Okay. We have an image here that is probably from the very beginning of time with DNA. I don't know, but it at least describes, well, I don't know what it describes, except that crime scene and suspect 1 match.
So this is very, very antiquated DNA testing technology that I actually have never used in my
before your
career.
time.
It was before my time. I did get to play around with it a little bit in college, but yeah, it is a very dated technique, and we have advanced significantly in the past 20 years or so.
Okay. So I was in a trial the end of last year, and they had a partial profile of a suspect. Mm-hmm. Now, this is a cold case, so it was 1984. Mm-hmm. It was before forensic DNA, was really a thing for criminals. So and crime fighting tools. So evidence may have been collected differently, 20 years later than it was in 1984. But it was collected. This was a rape kit that was done. By the time DNA came around and they realized again that they had an old case that DNA could help solve, the DNA has been badly degraded.
Okay.
So they ended up with a partial profile. Now you just told us that 23 loci, 23 locations you're looking for matches. That's a full profile, right?
So it's actually 24. It's 21 locations and then 3 gender identification locations, yeah.
And does that equal a full profile?
That is a complete DNA profile.
Okay.
Correct.
So a partial profile would mean that some of those locations you couldn't get genetic information from.
Correct.
All right. See, I've been around it a little bit.
Really good.
So that doesn't mean that a person is not that contributor to the degraded profile. It means, again, in layman's terms, that where a complete profile, there's no one else on this planet that would have it other than an identical twin. If there's a partial profile, there may be other people on the planet that have that same partial profile.
So if it's a partial profile, I can still make a comparison from that partial profile to a known individual. Yes.
And do you give an analysis that is, we always hear there was a DNA match, there's 1 in 400 quadrillion, ratio that this person is the person who did it. There's basically, there's not enough people on our planet to have somebody else with that DNA profile.
So oftentimes the statistic that is generated, it gives weight to an inclusion of an individual to a mixture, or the match of a known individual to the item of evidence.
Right.
And that weight, the way we currently report it, it's called a likelihood ratio.
Okay.
So, and it's really a matter of probability, which we use in many different facets.
And it's like in the general population, right? So like you would find that DNA profile in 1 out of every.
So it's a little bit far out there, but it's the rarity or how common that profile is. It really has no basis on the current population of the Earth. It's based on the individuals who have ever lived, who are currently living, and who will ever live.
Right. And so I threw that out there, the population, and I think that's how the layperson thinks, because it's typically such a number that's so great that there literally aren't that many people on the planet currently, and so a partial profile. I'm trying to explain this because this is how I understood it while we were watching in the trial. Maybe they only had 12 locations or 8 locations. I can't remember specifically, but it wasn't the 24 that you look at to create a complete profile. And they tested everyone that had been around that victim that day. And the defense kept saying the suspect matched the partial of the 8 locations they had tested. The suspect matched all 8 of those. And then other individuals that had been there may have matched in 1 loci, maybe even 2 or 3 locations, but there were a number that they didn't match in.
Correct.
To have been the contributor to that evidence, you would have to match in every single location.
Correct.
So I was likening it to a combination lock, which only has 3. But if you imagine a combination lock with 24, if you only have 20 of those, it doesn't unlock.
Correct.
If you only have 1 or 2 of a 3 combination lock, that's not a match.
Right.
It has to be an exact match at every single one of those locations to be that individual.
Analogy.
All right. Well, I was trying to, like I said, it was I want to say 8, but I don't know if that's an increment that you do. That it could be, but it matched the suspect on every single one of the locations that they had, and then they kept bringing in these other people names and saying, well, look, they matched on 4 of them, or they matched on 6 of them. And I wanted to tell the prosecutor, look, tell that jury that doesn't mean anything. It means everything. It means they are not that person. They are not the contributor to that evidence that they,
So we do make exclusions, is what we call it. So, anything at any one of those locations, if an individual's DNA type is not represented, we can make an exclusion.
They are not the person that
they
left
may
that.
not have been a contributor to that DNA profile.
Yeah, I think it got really confusing for the jury, and I think that's part of the defense's job, is to try to make it confusing. But they kept throwing out numbers like that likelihood, or that it was 1 in 85,000 may have. But again, we're talking about a very, very stripped down, degraded DNA sample that only a few locations had were available.
Right.
And my argument, again, I couldn't say this in court, but my argument was, even if it is 1 in 84,000, there was one person in that apartment complex that day that matched on all those. There wasn't 84,000
Right.
that
And
may have.
That also goes back to what I was saying about DNA not being the end-all be-all. I mean, it has, in the forensics community, I think it's been termed like the golden standard, the gold standard.
Yeah.
But it is a collaborative effort on, the forensics and investigations part.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, the perfect case is you've got a surveillance camera that records, the crime. You have DNA evidence that is, matched completely. You have eyewitnesses all around, and that's great, but that's not always what we get. Sometimes you have to piece together things. Yeah. DNA obviously brings great weight to a case, but the idea that you can only convict if there's DNA,
correct?
And that hurts families like mine and the ones that we deal with a lot of times, because they think if there's not DNA, there's no case. But that's not true either. I mean, there have been plenty of convictions. I mean, let's talk about DNA as used criminally has only been around for 20 plus years now,
Yes.
So there were a lot of convictions before that without DNA.
Yeah.
And there have been a lot of convictions since then without DNA. And we've got a couple of questions come in, so I want to ask. And some of this, so DNA and fingerprints are two very different things, but a lot of times we hear DNA testing on fingerprints. We hear the media say that, and I guess if it was touch DNA, maybe that could be, touch DNA from a fingerprint. But fingerprints are a very different thing. FDLE does do latent prints and
Yes,
testing, and they can match a fingerprint to a suspect.
Yes.
But that's not what you do.
No.
This is a very different.
It's very different.
Yeah. So DNA and fingerprint. The question was, do DNA fingerprints expire over time? And I just wanted to separate them out first and make sure that we didn't confuse anybody that was watching, that we're talking about the same thing. They're different, but expire may not be the right word. Maybe it is. I don't know. But they do degrade.
DNA can degrade. There are a number of factors that go into maintaining and preserving the integrity of the evidence when it comes to DNA. But I have obtained complete DNA profiles from blood stains that were over 20 years old, if it is properly preserved. So there are environmental factors that can reduce the quality of the DNA that I obtain. So, for instance, an item of evidence that is collected from a crime scene, if it has been exposed to the natural elements such as the sun, rain, dirt, these different factors can degrade the DNA there, basically, which means it chops it up.
Yeah.
So I really cannot obtain complete information.
Right.
It makes it very choppy for me to read, and so I'm not comfortable making any comparisons to DNA that is very degraded.
Yeah.
Other factors include, was it packaged properly? And like you previously said, 30 years ago, we didn't know how packaging items of evidence could have long-lasting implications on our DNA. So, as long as it's been packaged properly and preserved properly, I can obtain DNA samples that are very, very old.
Yeah. We see this a lot with cold cases. There's still good evidence to be had a lot of times. And we've seen where evidence technicians from a long time ago did something that maybe wasn't the norm, or they didn't realize would actually preserve that for decades longer. But they're very highly trained and specialized in their field as well with evidence collection, always erring on the side of, let me throw this in a bag and seal it and try to keep it out of the sunlight and out of, but those are things. So when you have a case of maybe some remains are found And I mean, those are the ones you're talking about that could be very difficult. Maybe
Yes.
they've been in the woods for years. Whatever was on their person or left at the scene could have been damaged.
Correct.
So let's take, let's say something is collected today, at today's standards, a blood stain that is not the victim's and is a potential suspect's blood stain is obtained at a crime scene today and packaged as they do today and stored as they do today. If that case were to sit in the evidence locker for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, naturally would it degrade still or not?
No.
No. Okay. So I think that's
So
an important.
there are enzymes that could be present in certain stains that we may use for some of our bodily fluid identification testing.
Okay.
So some of the enzymes might degrade, and it may interfere with our ability to obtain a positive result for some of that preliminary testing. But as far as the DNA, it is
it's
preserved.
still going to be there. Okay.
Yes.
That's
Well,
encouraging.
And if we think about where the DNA is found, it's within the cell, and the cells are very difficult to open up. So it takes
Right.
a lot of heat and manipulation of the sample to get that
Okay.
DNA.
Thanks.
So-
That's great information. I mean, I learned so much doing what I do and talking to people like you, and you can see why something that's left out in the elements, wind, rain, sun, could potentially damage a lot of that. But you do wonder, because evidence technicians take precautions, detectives and lab analysts, everything has evidence tape on it, it's sealed, it's signed off on, and then it's put back the way it was found.
Correct.
So all with the idea that you may have to use that again sometime.
Yes. Yes. And each item has a chain of custody that follows with it, so we can document who has the item and when they had it.
Do you meet with detectives, homicide detectives, sexual assault detectives, like when they take us through the process of evidence collection? So they have the evidence, they submit it to your lab.
Correct.
Do they call you up and say, and maybe it's more with cold cases than hot cases, but do they call you up and say, hey, look, I've got a dress, I've got a shirt, I've got blood, I've got underwear,
Right.
like what,
Yeah.
let's be efficient.
So you are correct. I think most of the time when there is communication with a detective about case circumstances, it's usually in regards to a cold case.
Yeah. Okay.
Just because a good thorough inventory needs to be taken.
And some of that evidence has probably already been tested
Correct.
at some point
Yes.
along the way. So
Yeah. But normally, evidence is dropped off with our evidence technicians in our evidence intake section.
okay.
And it's given a unique laboratory identification number, and each item of evidence is given a unique item number within the laboratory, and it stays with that throughout its entire testing process.
Okay. Even years later, if technology isn't
Yes.
there yet, and you retest it years later, it maintains that number, and you have
It's completely
record
unique.
of everything that had been done prior, so you don't
Yes.
redo. Okay. Do you guys do hair
Yeah.
at FDLE?
Well, I can examine it for suitability for the type of DNA testing that I perform.
Okay. Does the root have to be attached?
There are a number of factors that I look at in considering whether or not a hair is suitable for STR DNA testing.
Okay.
Yes, a root does need to be attached, but it also needs to be in a specific growth stage,
Okay.
or it needs to have some kind of adhering cellular material to the root in order for it to be suitable.
Okay.
If it's not, there is something called mitochondrial DNA testing that can be performed on the hair. Mitochondrial DNA testing is inherited maternally, and we don't perform that type of testing at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, but there are other privately
Private
funded
labs.
laboratories that can.
Okay. That's interesting. So that was one of the questions we got. Can hair be tested without roots? And maybe mitochondrial.
Correct.
Mitochondrially. Maybe. Yeah. Okay. let me see what I got. Another question in here. If DNA is tested once with no results, can it be retested in the future? And we talked about that a little bit. You can use up all the DNA sometimes, but if you have enough DNA, then yes, you can retest it as technology advances.
Yes.
And you can talk a little bit more of that. You guys, I don't know how much is needed. You know, we're talking
Currently.
about small amounts of material that
Yes.
you're looking at. But
So it also depends on the source of DNA. If it's an item from, if there was a blood stain or a bodily fluid that I'm trying to obtain DNA from, I don't need very much at all.
Yeah.
If
it's one of those
swab,
highly rich.
correct.
Yeah.
It's a very, 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 very small amount.
Yeah.
20 years ago, it required usually consuming a whole stain.
Yeah.
Now I need a much smaller portion.
Yeah. So that, to answer that question, again, one of the things I've learned is that every single case is unique and individual. So it's hard to generalize and say, yes, DNA can be retested. In theory, yes, it can be retested.
Yes.
But there are
If the sample's available.
If the sample's available. And
Yes.
if you're talking about a case from 20 years ago that was tested 10 years ago, all of that comes into play. If it was tested 2 years ago, you may not retest it because the technology hasn't advanced to a place that you would get anything different than you received 2
Correct.
years ago. And what you don't want to do is consume a sample if you're not sure that you're going to, or relatively, sure that you're going to get some kind of different result.
Correct.
So,
You explained that very well.
thanks. Let me see. Do you test DNA on evidence at the scene or just after it has been collected from the scene? So
The evidence is collected by an evidence technician, by one of our contributing agencies, and they bring the evidence to our intake section, which then, once the case gets assigned to me, I will pick it up from our evidence custodian, and then I can begin my examination. So it's performed in a lab where I have to follow very strict quality control procedures.
are you all suited up?
Yes.
Like, do you have to make sure that you're not dropping any of your hair and
Correct.
sneezing
So-
onto a
Yes,
sample?
I have a mask that I wear, a lab coat, gloves, and a hairnet. And it's a very clean environment that I'm working in. I have to clean my areas and my utensils in between each item, and I use paper, and I only have one item of evidence open up at a time. So it's a very methodical and quality program that I have to follow.
Yeah. For obvious reasons.
Yes.
You don't want to cross-contaminate anything.
Correct.
I think, we had the state attorney, Melissa Nelson, in last week, and we were talking to her. Justice is not putting the wrong person away. So there are a lot of implemented procedures that you deal with on a day-to-day basis.
Yes.
To make sure that your DNA doesn't end up there, or that someone's, you mentioned doing criminal paternal testing,
Yes.
that doesn't end up in a murder suspect.
Correct.
And so, for all the right reasons, you guys do a lot of things that probably adds a lot of time to your day,
Yeah.
just preparing and getting ready.
Yes.
But that's the process.
So it's actually also a requirement for our laboratory. We maintain an accreditation.
Right.
And what that means is we've been given a formal recognition of our ability to demonstrate that we've adhered to standards set forth by the scientific community. And as part of that, we have to follow very specific procedures.
Yeah, and as a state lab, and we talked about all the different labs you have in the state, you guys handle, I won't say all, because I know that there are some police agencies that have a lab within, but you guys handle the bulk of all criminal
Yes.
lab testing in the state. There
Correct.
are private labs
Yes.
that
There are some
can
county
do
labs too.
and some county labs too. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
but pretty much you're the first stop in a criminal investigation when it comes to evidence testing.
DNA.
DNA, yes. and a lot of so then just we've dealt with private labs in the past. There are certain situations where they can be utilized for a variety of reasons, but everything's going to go through FDLE first, and even those private labs, you have to take ownership of that, so you have to kind of accredit the private labs to make sure that that they're suiting up correctly and testing things appropriately, right?
Not necessarily. Okay. So they, if we decide to, there's something that we often do to assist in reducing our backlog, in which we will outsource some of our cases to a privately funded laboratory.
Okay.
And in order to do so, we do have to do a formal quote unquote check of their accreditation and their procedures.
Okay. So those options are typically there's reasons why you would outsource your lab, just backlog. There's some situations where they do testing that you guys don't do. You talked about mitochondrial
Correct.
DNA. That might be a reason why you would, somebody would use a private lab, and that's usually law enforcement themselves.
Yes.
That kind of through conversation with you all and what you do and don't do decides what goes to a private lab or not.
Correct. We usually don't make any decisions about what is being sent to a private lab, with the exception of outsourced cases.
Gotcha.
That decision lies solely upon our contributing agency.
And okay, that makes sense. And one of the biggest reasons would probably be if you don't do mitochondrial and we need that, then we have to find somebody that does. All right. There was something else I don't know if we really, this may get too scientific, but is there a way to tell us how you take a sample and actually get DNA from it?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll give you my jury definition.
Okay, let's try that.
So I'll examine an item of evidence. Let's say I'm looking at a blood stain. I will take a cutting from whatever material it's on of that stain, just a very small cutting, and that's placed into a tube that has been given the same unique identifier that item received upon submission.
Okay.
And then that tube, I will add chemicals and heat, and that is done in order to remove the DNA from the inside of the cell.
Okay.
So at this point, I have the DNA, and then I have a bunch of cellular debris in the tube, and then I separate the DNA that's suspended in liquid.
Okay.
And place that into a new tube. That tube will be processed, and the next step will be to quantify how much DNA do I actually have in this sample. Too much or too little DNA can be problematic for my testing. So it's kind of like the Goldilocks effect, is what we call it.
What unit of measurement are we talking about when you say
talking about nanograms?
Nanograms.
Yes.
So
anything more than about 25 nanograms, and that's really hard for me to convey about.
Yeah, how much that is.
Yeah. Our ideal amount of nanograms that I usually am working with is usually around 0.75 or 1 nanogram.
Okay.
And with that, I can obtain complete information.
That's a small amount,
it's
though.
It's a very small
nanogram
amount. Yes.
is very small.
Yes, it is. So I, at that point, I can't look in the tube and count how much DNA do I have here. I place it on an instrument that tells me how much DNA is in that sample.
Okay.
From that point, I do something called PCR. It stands for polymerase chain reaction. And it's like a genetic Xerox machine.
Okay.
It makes millions and millions of copies of the DNA, similarly to how our body naturally replicates DNA.
Right. Okay.
And then the last step is that I place that sample onto another instrument that separates the DNA into individual fragments. It is then from that point, it generates a graph with a series of peaks and valleys. Each one of those peaks is the DNA type.
Okay.
So at that point, then I'll make my comparisons from the item of evidence to known individuals.
So yeah, is there a standard comparison? Like, do you know if a sample is victim, suspect, or do you just have a spot of blood and you create this graph, and then how does that work? How do you actually compare what you're seeing to what we want to know?
I separate my evidence into cues, or what's unknowns, or items of evidence obtained from the crime scene, basically.
Okay.
Or Ks, which are items from known individuals. And usually those come in the form of something called a buccal swab or buccal.
Right. What is the
tomato?
Okay, is that all it is?
There's roughly 20 laboratory analysts here in Jacksonville, and some of us say buccal, some of us say buccal.
Okay. That's what we see.
That's the collection
cheeks.
of the inside of the cheek swab.
Okay, we see that on TV.
It's a very rich source of DNA.
Okay, so those are your known. So those
Correct.
come in, and you mark them with a K, and they would be potentially from suspects.
Or they
victim,
could be from the victim. Or from elimination. Somebody who's, been living at the home, if it was
husband,
a home
wife,
invasion.
child,
Correct. Yes.
somebody whose DNA would be expected to be in
Correct.
the home.
Correct.
But you need to know if this specific sample is from someone that was supposed to be there or not.
Sometimes.
Okay, yeah. Or investigators need to know that. I guess you just need to provide the graph that shows who each sample belongs to. And so what do you do with that profile when you get it? When you have the graph and you've compared and you now know that this blood belongs to this person or to an unknown person, what's your process then?
So at that point, I will compare the two profiles. If there is a match, then I will perform statistical analysis to give a weight as to how rare or how common that DNA profile is. And like I previously said, that's done in the form of a likelihood ratio.
Okay.
And what I'm comparing is the probability that the DNA from that item of evidence originated from that individual versus the probability that the DNA obtained from that item of evidence was obtained from an unrelated, randomly selected individual.
Okay. And let me back up. When you get those known samples, do you run those tests first and then you move on to the Q samples and then you do the comparison? Does it matter? Is it just like the first?
It is recommended that the items obtained from the evidence obtained from the crime scene are examined first, followed by the known individuals. Yes.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. I was just curious how that works. We've been going for a while now, and I'm sure you have to get back to work, but there's a couple other things I want to hit on, and that is kind of the historical timeline of forensic DNA. We've hit on it a couple of times that, and kind of in that mid-90s range, I think, was the big breakthrough with forensic DNA used in criminal cases. And now we're in 2019, and, you've said some of the slides we showed earlier were before your time. It was very archaic. But tell us a little bit about, because we do deal with older cases typically, with cold cases. So, when a case prior to, and I don't know the exact date, but sometime in the mid-90s, is that right? Or maybe early 90s was when DNA came on? So
the first type of forensic DNA testing that was performed was something called RFLP. And that happened in the mid to late 80s. Okay. And then that was followed by something called DQ alpha polymarker, which happened, this kind of testing was performed in the late 80s and early 90s. The type of testing that I perform now, short tandem repeat DNA testing, was implemented by FDLE in 1998. It was
Okay.
Exposed to the forensic testing community in the mid-90s, and then FDLE, the Orlando region actually started doing STR DNA testing in 98, and then all of the other laboratories regions started STRs, and that's what we've been using since.
Yeah, so that's a solid foundation there.
Yeah.
You haven't switched up a lot on
Nope.
on the basics, but within DNA testing, there has been kind of an explosion of technological advances in
Yes.
how much DNA you need, where you can obtain DNA. Do you guys have an MVAC system?
We do not.
But that's
That is another technology that exists. And a lot of private labs, I believe, might be using it. Maybe some state-funded laboratories might be using it also.
And that's usually more for touch DNA
Yes.
to collect as much of it as possible, because again, we're talking about small amounts.
Correct.
Potentially. But so tell me a little bit more, like in your lab, what you've seen or what you've heard colleagues talk about. In my day, we had whatever. What's some of the exciting things that you see?
Some of the historical DNA testing techniques, we call them historical.
Right,
It's all
right.
within our generations, but they were very time-consuming, a lot more time-consuming than we currently have. But it also required a lot of sample.
Yeah.
Very tedious work. And now, with our current testing, it's become so sensitive, and we need very, very little sample to obtain a DNA profile. And moving forward, I mean, we have advancements in the world of genealogy, which actually, contrary to popular belief, is not so heavily focused on DNA. It's
Right.
really 95% investigative and about 5% science related.
Yeah, we haven't even touched on that,
Right.
because that's not really what you guys do.
Correct.
But that you use that DNA to identify a family line,
Correct.
and then you
Yep.
spend all of your time building family trees until they intersect, and then you have to build them back down to somebody that shared those DNA traits from whoever you were able to identify.
Yes.
And they had to be at the right place at the same time,
Right.
and all those things. So it's another tool,
Yes.
but it's very different than what you do.
Yes.
But
And it is a big collaborative effort between the state crime lab, the local law enforcement agencies, and private laboratories.
yeah.
Yeah.
What was I gonna? Oh, so one of the things I know that was kind of exciting for me, kind of feel like a scientist saying that this was exciting, but when you the STR mix, like the being able to separate mixtures of DNA, that had to be a pretty big moment in the labs.
Yes.
I'm sure that was frustrating to have what you thought was a really good sample
Yes.
because of size or whatever, but it was all multiple people
Correct.
included. So
So in the past, when I had samples of mixtures that I could not make any determinations regarding that mixture, I was really tied because of the ability to provide a statistical weight or to provide any statistical value to
Yeah.
that mixture. We didn't have a lot of options. So with this new technology, it's called StarMix. That's the name of the software that we use. Or
Yeah.
that's the way I pronounce it.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
STR mix, star mix. But it uses an algorithm, a computer algorithm, and basic mathematics, really, in combination with biological modeling to help give me the number of contributors and delineate each contributor in that mixture and provide the likelihood ratio for each contributor's contribution.
Yeah. That's a pretty big deal in crimes,
Yes.
now. So I know that that's something that has advanced. The ability for cold cases, particularly. We talked about some of the issues that your lab faces, which are, I would guess, a lot of times is degradation of evidence. Lost evidence. There's nothing you can
Yes.
do with.
Right.
So those are some of the hurdles. But a hurdle would have been, a mixture of DNA
Yes, certainly.
that you now have the ability to. You think of anything else with cold cases specifically that have been that are roadblocks your lab faces or hurdles? I mean, is that basically it? Degradation of DNA and
degradation, and I mean overall inventorying what is left to test, and then once we get something and we open it up and take a look at it, is there any sample left to even work with? That's one of the biggest roadblocks, and in the condition of the evidence as well.
Yeah. So we've gotten a number of comments about funding, which is something that should be really important to mention with FDLE. You're a state lab. There's no exchanging of, you're not, when
Correct.
Jacksonville Sheriff's Office submits evidence to you, you're all part of one team working on these cases.
Yeah, we are a publicly funded state government laboratory.
Right. So nobody, jumps in line because they have a bigger checkbook or, bigger
Correct.
bank account. That is not a hurdle within state lab testing and with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. Now, we have talked a lot about funding being an issue with cold cases, and a lot of times that is, and we've started a cold case resource fund, but that was specifically for maybe genetic genealogy testing, MVAC, mitochondria, stuff that is a private lab, stuff that does cost money above and beyond what you do every single day. But it is important to say that all of Florida Department of Law Enforcement's testing is publicly funded, and we're not looking for donations or dollars to get things tested or retested at your lab. We kind of have the benefit there that you guys have your lab, you're able to do a wonderful job with that evidence. If there reaches a point where you can't do anything else with it and somebody needs to look, law enforcement needs to look elsewhere, that is where money comes in. And private labs, they're privately funded. That means they are getting checks. So they cold cases in general, I like to think of them like Forrest Gump. They're like a box of chocolates. You just don't know what you're going to get when you open it up. Right.
And sometimes you'll find really good evidence that can be really helpful in a case. But sometimes they do require very, very special treatment, unlike other cases. One last thing I want to touch on and kind of explain is CODIS. CODIS is the combined DNA index system that's housed under the FBI. You knew that acronym. Good for you.
Thank you. I studied it before you got here, but I always know it's something like that, but I always get confused with the O combined.
It's combined.
But CODIS is the national database of DNA that state lab like yourself, when you get a profile, if it's unknown or known, does it matter? You upload all of them? How does that?
So CODIS is governed by FBI, and then the national level is maintained by the FBI also. Now we have a level within CODIS that's run by the state, and a level that's run at a local jurisdictions. And there's different indices within this database. We can enter profiles for missing persons, unidentified human remains. We can enter profiles from arrested individuals or convicted offenders, and we can enter profiles from unknown, or we call them forensic unknowns, which is a DNA profile that we obtain from an item of evidence that we have nobody to compare it to.
And the goal there is that maybe that individual was arrested in another state and had to submit their DNA, and when you submit your unknown, it hits with someone else's known entry, and then we have identified who left that evidence at our scene, and we're able to move forward with the
it's another investigative tool.
Right. So, but you guys do have you have a local database, and then you have a statewide, and those are they bigger?
So the way it works is the local database profiles are searched on a daily basis.
Okay.
I believe the state, I don't know for sure how often the state is searched, but the national level, the profiles are searched, I think, on a monthly basis. I could be wrong.
Yeah, but there, Do you have any idea how many?
There are millions
input?
of profiles in the national database.
Yeah, and
Millions.
you're inputting a good bit every time you upload. I would imagine uploads are probably done at one time.
Correct.
You collect them for the week or month or whatever it is, upload them, and then they're probably. I mean that
So
database
the
has got to be
is
huge
uploaded every day.
and then it goes up the same. All right. Is there anything that I didn't hit on that you think is probably
I don't think
valuable
so.
information for us? Clint, was there any other questions from anybody that I think we're good?
Yeah.
Amanda, thank you so much for
Yeah.
taking time out. And,
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and explaining this stuff to us. We get these questions so often from families. I've had to learn a lot of it, but I'm not always confident in what the answers I'm giving. And so I always have to preface it by,
sounds like you know
I'm
what you're
not,
talking about.
Well, thanks. I know a little bit. I know enough to spend an hour with you, but
Yeah.
I don't know. Hopefully we're giving out good information. I'm always worried that we're not. So I'm always cautious to give out some information on something I don't know about.
Yes.
But I have immersed myself somewhat in this world that you live in, just enough to be able to explain it to families, hopefully so they understand a little better, because it can lead to frustration when they think there was DNA. They were told, somebody told them there was DNA, but there hasn't been an arrest. And as you know, as we've talked about today, there could be, countless reasons why that's the case. So it's always good to get this information out there and allow people to understand a little bit better what the process is and why it's not always instantaneous, and why sometimes technology, we have to wait on technology to catch up, so to speak. So, all right, well, thanks a lot. Maybe we can have you back with more specific questions or something in the future. We didn't really talk about any specific cases, but you did have one specific case that you had brought with you. I mean, can you just kind of give us a brief? I just saw it sitting there. I forgot about it.
No, I asked one of my coworkers, if any cold cases of hers really just stuck in her mind, and she recalled the case that she worked. The victim's name was, I believe it was called Cherie. Her name was Cherie Morissette. Back in 1996, this little girl apparently was in an argument with her sister or sibling and left the home, and she was found in the St. Johns River 6 days later, deceased. And she actually identified semen on the child's sock.
Wow.
Yeah.
They're floating in the water.
Yes. She found semen on the sock and obtained a profile. It went into the database, and it sat there for 10 years until an individual was arrested on, I believe it was a sexual assault charge up in Connecticut, and it hit to that individual's profile, and he has been since adjudicated guilty and is serving life in St. Johns County. Wow,
that's a great story, and that's why a lot of the work that you do and investigators do, it doesn't always pay off the next day or the next week or the next month, but we stick with it. We do it because it's the right thing to do, and we know that there's a chance that one day that those answers will come.
Yes.
So,
exactly.
Well, thank you for shining that light and allowing us to understand better why we should maintain that hope that that one day we'll get those answers.
Yes.
And hopefully we'll have you back again soon, and we'll talk about some of this stuff maybe a little more specifically. We did the broad stuff. Now we can focus a little more. All right.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right, Amanda. Thanks a lot. And we'll see you guys next week with another guest.